For a little over 2 weeks after beating Final Fantasy XVI, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I would replay scenes from the game in my mind, listen to the game's soundtrack on loop, watch other people's reactions to certain events. It was a borderline obsession, and for the briefest of times, I simply had no desire to play anything else, except perhaps more Final Fantasy XVI. This was hardly the first time I've had this kind of experience. The symptoms line up neatly with a concept called post-series depression, described as the feelings of melancholy and longing that can occur when an individual's all-consuming film or screen product comes to an end. And though research on whether the concept transfers neatly to video games is sparse, there may be validity to the idea, with one paper finding a similar phenomenon of a state of media anhedonia and reminiscing about a game, particularly in the context of playing a meaningful, story-driven game that the player heavily invests in, both time-wise and emotionally-wise. A description which seems perfectly apt for a game like Final Fantasy XVI. Considering the evidence, it seems clear to me that I had experienced some kind of post-game depression, but this answer wasn't very satisfying to me at all, because as much as I could recognize I liked Final Fantasy XVI, I really couldn't explain why. I mean, what's really so great about this game? In thinking about it, I often found my playthrough was marked with the exact opposite emotions, confusion, frustration, much more so than one would associate with some supposedly exultant experience. On the contrary, Final Fantasy XVI has many things to be annoyed about. Take for instance the story. Since arguably most of your time playing the game is centered around watching characters talk, one would hope that the narrative would be strong enough to support this kind of investment. It very frequently is not. 16's story is an intriguing exercise, a game which systematically destroys all of its good characters and storylines until it's left with only the least interesting one, ultimately putting all of its chips on the wrong horse, figuratively and somewhat literally. Benedicta is a character whose life seemingly consists of nothing more than serving whoever is most convenient at the time, using her power as a dominant to maintain a position of respectability. So when that power is later stripped from her, it opens up a whole number of interesting possibilities. How might she navigate a life in which her only form of respect has been taken from her? It's certainly an intriguing question. Unfortunately, it's only an intriguing question, because Benedicta is shortly killed by yours truly before any interesting questions can even begin to be explored. Dion is generally one of the more successful characters in 16, but opposite to Benedicta, the game skips the beginning of the story. From pretty much our introduction to the character, the game spells out that Dion will betray his father, with one character helpfully expositing that a shadow of treachery hangs over Prince Dion. It's not that this is a bad starting point per se, but it feels like something of a missed opportunity that we don't actually see this complete transformation. Dion claims his father has become a changed man, but how much is this really true? Perhaps Dion himself has changed, and this is what led to his inevitable treachery. With what we have now though, Dion's specific characterization remains unclear, a sketch of a story rather than the complete thing. Jill is a particularly problematic character. She is, frankly, not very interesting, and that's mostly because the game doesn't take her seriously. She mostly spends her runtime in the story dawdling in the background, occasionally chiming in to add some needed exposition. Or more frequently, the game finds excuses to just completely write her out of the story, whether that be delegating her to side tasks or removing her dominant abilities, and thus her usefulness to the plot. 16 does attempt to tell one story with Jill, but it remains woefully underdeveloped. She believes her time as a slave to the Iron Kingdom has made her an irredeemable monster, and so she tasks herself to return to the island and claim retribution. An interesting start, but 16 is very obviously not interested in this particular narrative strain. Whereas we see many cutaway scenes and flashbacks of other characters, we're given precious little besides brief descriptions of what life was like for Jill under her 13 or so years of enslavement, and certainly no meaningful exploration of the emotional toll it took on her. The plot stops and starts within the span of 2 or so hours, and then Jill is right back to being the bland piece of pablum she was at the start of the game. More critically, however, is that there's never the sense the version of Jill this story presents exists outside the confines of this specific plot. Jill's experience in the Iron Kingdom, or her very negative internal view of herself, never seems to be reflected in the kinds of decisions she makes, who she interacts with, or how she interacts with them. Jill's life as a slave is only a relevant point of characterization for scenes in which her life as a slave is the specific subject of that scene, whereas a better character would integrate this characterization into a more enduring constellation of traits which express themselves outside the demands of the immediate plot. Barnabas, well, what can I say about Barnabas really? Very little, actually, because the game spends far too little time on his character. He is a devout follower to Ultima, but the reason why is vastly open to interpretation. The game emphasizes a bizarre connection between him and his mother, and that his mother is in some way the key to Ultima's hold on him. On the face of it, the scene appears to present Barnabas' relation to his mother as classically Oedipal, with his mother appearing to him naked in bed. However, David Menken, the English voice actor for Barnabas, insists this simply isn't the case.
The only thing that awakens any kind of humanity in him is the sight of his mother. And it's a scene that's freaking people out. But I don't think they quite understand it because they see it as something sexual. But what Ultima is doing is Ultima is giving him a gift for saying and doing the right things.
It's a pretty good interpretation of the character, but the real problem is that Menken is doing far too much work for the game. It would have been infinitely more interesting had 16 actually gone to any length in fleshing out this apparently not so sexual relationship with his mother, or better yet, why he has this particular relationship at all. Much like Dion, watching Barnabas slowly turn towards Ultima's right-hand man could have been very interesting. Instead, it's a footnote in a text file. Last but not least, we have our leading man, Clive. Now, one would expect the main character of the piece to be the most solid character in the lineup, but this jury of one is a little less sure. I like Clive just fine, as I do most of the characters I've already complained about, but it seems to me that the game blunders what should be a fairly simple character arc. The setup is extremely enticing. Clive, in a chaotic battle, murders his younger brother in the form of his dominant, Ifrit, but due to his lack of control over Ifrit, he experiences this event as a sort of out-of-body, omniscient presence, as if he were a helpless onlooker. So when he vows to take revenge against his brother's murderer, it creates a powerful dramatic irony, a revenge quest against himself. Unfortunately, the 13-year time skip that follows does its best to undermine this premise. Not only, much like with Jill, does this maneuver expertly dodge Clive's life as a slave to the Empire of Sanbreque, it fails to capitalize on the very purpose of the dramatic irony. This 13-year period should be the time where we see Clive deal with the trauma of the situation and dedicate himself to his revenge quest. And in doing so, the dramatic irony creates a double tragedy. Not only has Clive lost his brother in a heart-wrenching attack, but we as the audience understand that his one source of reprieve is futile. He can never take revenge against Joshua's murderer, because the murderer is himself. But we're robbed of this scene by having the game skip over the most critical juncture of Clive's life, and Clive ultimately discovers that he is the murderer and that Joshua is still actually alive before the end of the first half. One almost wonders what the point of the entire exercise even was. This problem later compounds for the character. Because Clive has essentially completed his character arc by the end of the first act, the rest of the game struggles to find something interesting for him to do. The game later insists that Clive needs to save himself from his self-hating tendencies, but it's difficult to understand this conflict. What exactly does Clive find so monstrous about himself? This story would work infinitely better had Joshua remained dead, but by the time we reach the scene with Clive and Jill on the beach, that ship has long since sailed. What regrets does Clive have about his actions and conduct? Whew. That was a little exhausting. As I'm sure you can tell, I have a few problems with the story of this game. What might be more exhausting though is the fact that I barely even scratched the surface. For instance, why does no one seem to react to the destruction of the Mothercrystals, Valistea's main export of magic? Why does the game hide what's going on with Dion until after the fight with Bahamut, thereby disrupting the causal flow of the story with a 40-minute boss fight that feels thinly justified until the game actually spends time justifying it? And why does Final Fantasy XVI have an ambiguous ending to begin with? Ambiguity works best when there's something ambiguous about the story, a moral dilemma, a character motivation, but there distinctly isn't that by the end of the game, and so it feels pointless. I mean, if the game just outright told us that Clive survived and wrote a book under Joshua's name, what would that really change in regards to the meaning of the game's ending? It doesn't seem like much, and that was a little exhausting. As I'm sure you can tell, I have a few problems with the story of this game. I suppose the real reason the story often irritated me is that all of these problems were juxtaposed with its perfect introduction. The first 2 hours of this game are masterfully done, and the scene where Joshua is murdered is legitimately one of the most powerful scenes I've seen in a video game in quite some time. I suppose I was hoping there would be even a single moment in the rest of the game that would come close to the power that scene had, but it was not to be. The best part of 16's story is its prologue, which probably isn't something you want for your 40+ hour narrative-driven game. So back to our original question. If the word vomit you've heard up until now is what's been swirling in my mind, I'm sure you can understand my confusion. What could possibly be the source of this post-game depression? It might be tempting to say that my positive feelings came from the icon battles, giant kaiju fights that play out in truly spectacular fashion, but these fights only comprise maybe a few hours total of my nearly 50-hour game. A few giant boss fights seems like an unsatisfactory and painfully shallow answer. Surely Final Fantasy XVI has more merit than a few fireworks. For as negative as I've been on the story of 16, there's an argument to be made that it's actually quite good. That is, both the story and the argument for it. I think this is most apparent in the clear grasp the game has on its world and characters. There's a scene in the intro to the game, a glob of characters sitting around a table discussing the strained politics of Valisthea as a battle of seemingly major significance is being waged nearby. It was precisely the kind of scene I was fearing when I picked up the game. I remember reading up about a mechanic called active time lore, essentially an on-the-fly glossary that you could use during any cutscene to read up about certain characters, factions, and settings. At first glance, it seemed like such a mechanic would be great, especially for a high fantasy setting based off of Game of Thrones. But in perhaps my more cynical fashion, I worried ATL would be a massive crutch, a tool to escape explaining pertinent details of the story and leave it to the glossary to fill in the blanks. And scenes where 7+ characters nonchalantly describe the relations between the Republic and Empire and Kingdom were the perfect fodder for this kind of overindulgence. To my pleasant surprise though, this really couldn't be further from the truth. Looking back at this scene, it's remarkable how much I understand about everything that's going on here. I could accurately describe to you every single character in this scene, what their motivations and personalities are, and who they're affiliated with. And I learned all of that information just by playing through the game, not by stopping cutscenes to read mandatory text files. The rest of the game proceeds similarly, and I found myself not needing the ATL for, well, really anything, which is probably the most glowing recommendation I can give such a feature. I think it takes a deft hand to slowly untangle the web of a setting presented by the opening hours, and Final Fantasy XVI ought to be praised for this. More broadly, scenes like this, and the explicitly documented Game of Thrones inspiration, did little to set the game up for success. There's a sense in which the demo for Final Fantasy XVI painted the wrong kind of picture. It presents the game as an intertwining, complex political thriller, but that's really just about the last thing 16 desires to be. Contrary to some critical opinions, 16's narrative course correction is less than gradual. It's fairly clear that the game is building up to Ultima as the big bad from the beginning. It's clear that the larger societal structures of Valisthea are not as important as the magical, life-draining Mothercrystals. By the end of the first act, the siege of the Sanbrechian Empire culminates not in a face-off with the Empire itself, but with a battle in some interdimensional rift against the otherworldly Typhon. Ultima even appears in the prologue, and is integral in many scenes afterwards, so when he eventually hogs the stage in the final act, it really isn't that surprising, all things considered. Beyond the opening 2 hours, the game sets the expectations pretty clear. Final Fantasy XVI is less interested in capturing the spirit of Game of Thrones than it is the aesthetics. While that may be disappointing, I think it's a mistake to let the conversation end there. We ought to also examine the actual merits of how 16 goes about being itself. In typical JRPG fashion, 16 switches gears in its final act to relatively grounded conflicts to apocalyptic, deity-induced doomsdays. But as many have correctly pointed out, this transition is hardly a thematic non sequitur, as most of the game is focused on the plight of the bearers and dominants as slaves in the working order of Valisthea. Ultima represents the most exaggerated version of this relation. He is the slave master who denies the moral rights of all humanity and relegates them into slavery. This is none too subtly pointed out by Ultima himself, telling Clive,
"Have you learned nothing? Damned is the slave who would turn the spirit upon his master."
Yet there's the sense that the game is suggesting a more interesting relation between Ultima and humanity than simply master and slave. Ultima is also the father of humanity. Rather than simply stumble upon these creatures, Ultima explains that he deliberately planted the seeds of humanity so that, given time, they would have a will strong enough to wield the power to remake the world. This new world would first and foremost see the flourishing of Ultima's kind. Humanity in this plan is little more than a means to an end. This precise argumentation is found elsewhere too. Annabella, Clive and Joshua's mother, frames her children in the same manner, arguing that her motivation for having children was to protect their noble bloodline. Furthermore, Annabella imagines this protection would later blossom into a superior power, giving her the ability to birth a savior of the land, blessed by both Bahamut and the Phoenix. In such a way, Annabella's quote-unquote love of her children is entirely conditional on their ability to produce this world-remaking power. Just like Ultima's plan for humanity, at both ends, they reject the very personhood of their creations, connecting the idea of master and slave to that of parent and child. Ultima's fatherhood is established in much more subtle ways, however. Much has been said about Ben Starr's excellent performance as Clive, but much more should be said about Harry Lloyd's equally stellar performance as Ultima. Ultima is a mess of contradictions, simultaneously alien but human, robotic yet emotional. His upright pose and upward posture suggest condescension, yet his facial expressions remain static. Ultima's dialogue is vicious and hostile, yet Lloyd plays the character with an unnervingly flat affect, both softly spoken yet punctuating specific syllables with strange emphasis.
This is our world. Once the land's rebirth is complete, humanity will have served its purpose. Why would we continue to suffer that which has caused us so much vexation?
Ultima exists in the uncanny valley, a being who attempted to cast off the vestiges of personhood, but couldn't quite go all the way. The most bizarre example takes place in a scene with Barnabas near the end of the game. Ultima appears before him in the forms of other people, naked. Much like the rest of this ostensibly M-rated game, the camera configures itself to avoid showing any personal attributes. Yet strangely enough, the game continues the act even when Ultima reveals himself. A lit brazier hangs just in front of his figure, cutting away right before the camera pans beyond the brazier and onto his crotch. The implication is that Ultima has genitalia, but as we've already seen multiple times before this, he absolutely doesn't. At least, not in the traditional sense. From just the camera itself, Ultima is framed as a sort of sexual object, reaffirming a certain level of humanity to the character even when the rest of him attempts to deny it. In this way, Ultima is not merely a metaphorical father, but a very literal one as well. Ultima in this scene is cast as the father-like figure to Barnabas, juxtaposed immediately after with a vision of his mother. JRPGs are often criticized for always ending the game by killing God, but in the ways I've described, Final Fantasy XVI is in some ways a subversion of this trope, making it clear that, really, Ultima isn't much bigger of a threat than Annabella was. There's a sense in which Final Fantasy XVI finds parenting terrifying, that any one human being could have so much control and influence over any other individual, that in some fashion, the only kinds of parents are tyrants, be they benevolent or otherwise, and a parent who is unwilling to let their child flourish can effortlessly shackle and deny them the very goods of life they themselves enjoy, effectively relegating their own flesh and blood to a kind of bondage and servitude. It is a game about the horrors of parental control. Final Fantasy XVI may not realize a lot of its characters as fully as I would have liked them to, but it's pretty hard to complain about what's happening on the screen most of the time. The emotional beats all land when and where they need to. Cid's death is impacting and heartfelt, the scene where Dion accidentally murders his father is phenomenally tense, and Clive's breakdown at the end of the game is suitably heart-wrenching. It is a story filled with great little moments, even if the complete package isn't quite as ambitious as I wanted it to be. And as I've hopefully demonstrated, even if Ultima isn't the memorable all-time villain everyone was hoping for, he's far from some casual afterthought. In the end, I find myself going back to the beginning. The scene where Joshua is murdered is legitimately one of the most powerful scenes I've seen in a video game in quite some time. Maybe the rest of the game couldn't hold a candle to the prologue, but then again, most other games couldn't either.
Murderer. I'll kill you! I'll fucking kill you!
So why do I like Final Fantasy XVI? Much like the story, I like it because of its tiny little details and eccentricities, the things that show the game was more than a series of half-baked concepts haphazardly assembled. No discussion of Final Fantasy XVI would be complete without talking about the icon fights, and for good reason. It is too little to call them merely good. Extravagant is underselling it. Shocking is probably the best word to use. These are the kinds of scenes that would make the CGI action climax of any summer blockbuster blush, and the fact that the game provides multiple scenes of this type is just crazy on top. But again, it's not that they're simply flashy. Pretty explosions can get you a long way, it's true, but dig beneath the surface and you'll find the same intriguing level of detail and polish found elsewhere. Take the first real icon fight in the game, Garuda. Forget murder and strung up corpses. Garuda's icon fight proves to be the most violent part of the game by a significant margin. The battle plays out like a savage cage match, as Garuda and Ifrit pin and maim each other, ripping and tearing themselves apart limb from limb. After breaking off his arm, Garuda stabs into Ifrit's chest and face with knife-like talons, while Ifrit swings Garuda around like a doll, heaving her leg off in the process. The battle concludes with Ifrit holding Garuda by the arms, literally searing her flesh with fire while she struggles away from our grasp. At one point, Ifrit towers above Garuda with an almost grin, as if he were basking in the brutality of it all. This battle is quite a bit different from all the other icon fights that succeed it. Rather than scaling animated mountains or extravagant interstellar combat, there's a more personal and intimate connotation here, something more carnal and unfiltered. It makes a great deal of sense. At this point in the story, Clive has yet to come to terms with what he is, and has yet to accept the truth as it were. Characterized by Ifrit's yellow eyes, it's clear that Clive is not at all in control of this power. It is the only icon fight where these facts are true. As such, the very choreography of Garuda's encounter integrates itself within the context of the story, offering a unique vantage point from what would otherwise be one of the game's more underwhelming icon fights. Underwhelming being an extremely relative term here, of course. In a similar vein to Garuda's, the rest of the icon fights are just as satisfying. Whereas the Garuda fight was restricted to an enclosed patch of forest, the Typhon fight occurs in a wide empty arena, giving us ample opportunity to practice using wildfire. The battle plays out very differently as a consequence. Instead of giant, sluggish smackdowns and destroying limbs, the Typhon fight asks us to avoid giant AoEs, gliding around the zone as if on ice skates. While the Titan fight is comparatively more restrictive, it still features a section where Ifrit runs down a large rocky corridor. Our fiery demon friend is apparently both an adept figure skater and trained marathon runner, and that's before Ifrit eventually gains the ability to fly. This is all to say the progression here is quite freeing, and Ifrit feels better to control the further out in the game you go. Simple, perhaps, but the icon fights are one of the clearest and most effective story-to-gameplay integrations I can remember, as we vicariously feel Clive's acceptance of himself materialized in our ever-increasing control over the icon. It's difficult to fathom exactly how much work went into these fights. One interview with Ryota Suzuki, the game's combat director, explains that the icon battles are so large-scale that 10 months to a year are allotted for the creation of just one piece of content. Elsewhere on GameStop, Hiroshi Takai and Naoki Yoshida, the game's director and producer respectively, corroborate this claim. There's a section of the interview in which the two examine a single moment near the end of the Phoenix vs. Ifrit fight, where the player is supposed to be targeting Ifrit in the background. They explain that because it was too difficult to parse where Ifrit actually was, they asked the programmers to create a completely unrealistic light source to illuminate the surroundings and make the situation more readable.
光源ってどこにも存在してないんですよね。
ないんです本当は。
だからもうこのシーンはターゲットであるイフリットをちゃんと描かなきゃいけないので。でもイフリット自体を発光させるとまたフェニックスと
かぶっちゃう
区別がつかないので、無理やりここにね嘘のライトとかをつけてぼんやり
An explanation filled with circles and arrows, it's obvious a lot of thought was put into just that moment alone, but it simultaneously makes the rest of the game that much more unbelievable. If this much thought was placed into a simple light source, I can't imagine how many different considerations were required to get the other icon fights just right in their infinitely grander scale and complexity. How many iterations did it take to get Bahamut's Mega Flare looking exactly right? It's unclear from Suzuki's quote alone whether or not the icon fights collectively took around a year to develop, or if that was just the time frame for each encounter individually, but considering the insights given from Takai and Yoshida, the latter doesn't seem so far-fetched. I found myself thinking more and more about what it means to be immersed in a piece of fiction. People always seem to talk about immersion as some end-all be-all, the product of near-perfect execution, a work so transcendental it allows you to experience imagination as if it were actually real. I've become somewhat disillusioned with this perspective, perhaps in no small part due to the fact that I've increasingly found it more difficult to become immersed in general. Instead of familiarizing myself with the characters and setting, I find myself thinking more about how it all came to be. In that sense, I view Valisthea less as a grandiose fantasy world and more like a series of programs and textures divvied up between developers over the course of years of work. At first, I thought this was a depressing transition, an indication that I've finally outgrown a childhood sense of wonder. Now I can only see the mundane, the ordinary. But over time, I've increasingly found that the creators behind the art and their methods and/or perspectives are just as interesting as the final product itself. As cool as becoming invested in a fantasy world can be, there's also something cool in seeing someone else's realized vision, something fascinating about watching another person's meticulous plans unfold, and observing how the thoughtful little details add up to form a larger whole. There's something valuable to be found in the mundane, and so my view of games, and really media in general, has trended away from talking about whether something is good or bad, and more toward how and why. And when a work has interesting answers to the latter two, I find myself much more appreciative and excited about it. This is not to say there shouldn't be any more room to talk about good or bad, or that I've suddenly become some enlightened adjudicator where every piece of media is exactly as interesting as each other. I just think there's something to be said for the phrase, you get out what you put in. Why do I like Final Fantasy XVI so much? Frankly, it's because the icon fights are just awesome, a masterclass in presentation and execution. And it's also because of that brazier covering up Ultima's non-existent genitalia, because of that scene where the Emperor of Sanbreque parrots Annabella's viewpoints verbatim, demonstrating just how warped the Empire has become hours before we even learn what Annabella's viewpoint even is. Because of the game's carefully considered placement of unadulterated, bloodthirsty violence. Final Fantasy XVI presents a merely good story, elevated by the small handcrafted details. These details resonate precisely because they're non-random. Someone intended them to be there. Final Fantasy XVI may not be exactly what I wanted it to be, but it is exactly what it wanted to be, and it goes about that in some pretty compelling and awe-striking ways. It's hard not to be inspired by that.